What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and we're talking about something a little bit different today. Just this week, Privateer Press, the creators of the popular wargame Warmachine and Hordes, announced that they would be releasing a new edition for the game. This is going to be the 4th edition of the game, and comes, I think, pretty excitingly after a little bit of a flop that was the game's 3rd edition. Now, for those who don't know, I sort of cut my teeth as mostly a gamer, but also a little bit on YouTube, talking about Mark II and Mark III Warmachine and Hordes. So I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the Mark IV announcement. That said, I know that this isn't my normal content, so probably less people are going to watch this video, so we're going to do this in a little bit more casual, kind of discussion-oriented format. So, I don't know, grab a drink, sit back, and let's friggin' talk about some Warmachine and stuff. So the first thing I want to do is give a little bit of a background to the game of Warmachine and Hordes for those who might not be necessarily familiar with it. Warmachine and its sister game, which uses the same system and is totally compatible, so usually it's just called Warmachine and Hordes, is a skirmish game that really hit its stride somewhere in the mid-2010s when Games Workshop and the Warhammer games were imploding on themselves. Warmachine came in with a tight rule set and extremely competitive gameplay and took a lot of the competitive tournament players from Warhammer and the Games Workshop games and built itself a brand. That said, things have not been going quite as well for the community or the game since then. With a game as competitively oriented as Warmachine was, there was an immense learning curve to the game and a pretty big barrier to entry, since while armies are significantly smaller and in a lot of instances less expensive than armies for Warhammer, there were a myriad of supply chain issues that were constantly plaguing the company, and it was oftentimes difficult to get a hold on the models that you wanted. That said, in 2017, the game re-released with its 3rd edition, Mark III. I remember being extremely hype all the way through the Mark III announcement and release because the company did a great job at getting their hype engine going, making it a big, exciting event for the community. That said, the Mark III release didn't go as well as they'd hoped. Unfortunately, it had been pushed forward about a year, I think in part to respond to some of the success that Warhammer 40,000 was having, some of its more recent editions. That meant that the edition was plagued with all sorts of mechanical issues, and the supply chain problems that the company had been having in the past continued through that new edition. On top of that, after the edition's release, the design team really changed tack on how they wanted the game to be played going on into the future. Now, I'm going to get a little bit personal here because this is the part where I ended up falling out of love with Warmachine and Hordes, and I ended up actually quitting the game and selling off my collection, which was a big deal because it was a huge part of my life at that time. One of the core tenets of Mark II and early Mark III Warmachine and Hordes was sort of total player control over the composition of your army. Unlike Warhammer 40,000, there was nothing like a battlefield role slot or a force organization chart that required you to take particular units in a particular quantity for your army to be legal. Instead, the game revolved around a character called a warcaster, who had a set of abilities and spells they could use that really defined what your army was good at. From there, your warcaster, or in the case of horde factions that used monsters instead of robots, you had a warlock. That character would control a battle group, which is a series of these big monsters and robots. The game was constructed very heavily around resource mechanics, where your leader character could use these resources to empower the models in their battle group. However, from there, the composition of the battle group and the other units you can include in the army were basically free form. And on top of that, there were a lot of cross-faction mercenary units that could add a ton of different tools in your toolbox when constructing your army. That made list construction in the game very agile, and on top of the game being relatively well balanced, especially compared to some of the more recent editions of Warhammer 40,000, a lot of times armies could pivot their composition to respond to different threats in the metagame. That said, about a year into Mark III Warmachine, in order to reduce the barrier of entry to the game, the decision was made to change the design ethos towards one favoring armies called theme forces. Now, if you play Warhammer 40,000, you may be familiar with Armies of Renown, and this concept is almost identical to theme forces. A theme force was a particular army list that restricted the composition of your army to only a couple different units. In fact, we can actually see the breakdown of theme forces in their online store. You can actually see the models available for each one of your themes. So if we look at the Signar Storm Division here, they would only allow selections of models basically from this short list in armies of that theme force. So that basically took all that creativity and flexibility away from the player and restricted their army composition composition down to a very select few models. That was pretty disappointing, and it put a lot of the power of factions into how powerful and flexible their theme force options were, rather than the power of their warcasters and, you know, actual skill at list composition. It made a lot of lists look almost identical and really kind of ruined the game, at least for me from a personal standpoint. And from there, in conjunction with kind of a rebrand on Games Workshop's part with their 8th and 9th editions of Warhammer 40,000, a lot of players ended up abandoning ship from Privateer Press and moving over to other games, and their community took a monumental nosedive. I can't imagine that for a relatively small company like Privateer Press, and not being able to showcase the game at events or tournaments for a really long time because of the pandemic has been particularly healthy for them, and I'm sure that that has contributed as well. So that's why, in my opinion, and especially as somebody who still exists within a group of people who are closely associated with Privateer Press games, it's very exciting to see them announce a brand new edition of the game. So with that background out of the way, a super long background, but you know, we got through it. What I'd like to do is just go through the announcement and give a little bit of a review of my thoughts on what this new edition is going to look like. Now, from the get-go, this announcement is it's just a really long Word document, which is a little bit boring, so that sucks. Essentially, what the announcement has been so far is an FAQ trying to head off any criticism of the new edition. I think this is mostly for people who are already players of Warmachine and Hordes, but as somebody who's looking to get back into the game, it doesn't exactly fill me with confidence that they don't have that many exciting things to say about their new game. Instead, they're mostly assuaging people to try to prevent them from buying out of the old game. Despite the fact that at the end of the day, Mark III didn't end up particularly well for Warmachine and Hordes, at the get-go, the reveal of the edition was extremely exciting. Custom website that they built specifically just for this announcement, which is still live at allnewwar.com. Check it out because this website is actually very cool and very informative about the game, despite the fact that it's totally out of date now. And on top of that, they commissioned a whole new and absolutely gorgeous animation featuring two of the poster children of the game fighting it out and hiring Marisha Ray from Critical Role to voice it, which was kind of a big deal and super exciting at the time. Games Workshop is now, basically doing the exact same thing with their new animations, especially after the 9th edition Warhammer 40,000 release. In comparison, this announcement is very bad, so we'll get that out of the way here. I also want to shout out that the actual video announcement for the new edition comes a full 2.5 minutes into a different video. They didn't even put the trailer up by itself on their YouTube channel. They just embedded it into a regularly scheduled release. And I'm sure I might be reading into this too far, but that kind of speaks to me that they're not that committed to this re-release, and it's just sort of part of the normal release schedule. Whereas, unlike a game like Warhammer, which gets new editions all the time, a 4th edition for Warmachine and Hordes is like actually a really big deal, especially with all the changes that they're trying to make to the game to make it more accessible for new players. A new player that isn't already watching their regularly scheduled broadcasts would have no idea that this new edition is coming out, which isn't super helpful to the demographic that they're specifically trying to target with it. I'm not saying that this is going to have anything to do with the mechanics or the release of the edition itself, but from the perspective of the attitude of the company, I'm not exactly filled with confidence by the fact that it seems like they themselves have so little confidence in their own release that they aren't going to put it front and center of their marketing. But anyway, let's talk about the actual nuts and bolts of this announcement. Now, they talk about some of the challenges in re-releasing Warmachine, and one of the things that was made apparent sort of towards the tail end of the Mark III edition was that the size and kind of ponderous bulk of the game was really weighing it down. Unlike Warhammer, which goes through and re-releases existing armies periodically in order to continue its content drops, you can see that, a lot of the armies in the game are not new. They're 20 or 30 years old, and a lot of those models themselves not only aren't that new, but also just get new sculpts with maybe 1 or 2 additional character models coming out each edition for each faction. Now, say what you will about that release cycle, what it doesn't do is create immense amounts of SKU bloat. And that was a real problem that Privateer Press had with Warmachine, because they would constantly be releasing new models and units for each of their armies that players would have to buy, which was great, but almost impossible to penetrate into for a brand new player. So as a response to that, what they're doing is actually essentially creating a legacy format for the the game. They're going to offer an unlimited mode of play, which will include rules for all of the past units in the game. However, that's going to be contrasted with Prime, which will only allow players to play the new models that have been released with the 4th edition. Now, this is both good and bad, I think. Now, this change is both good and bad, because speaking of someone who's no longer has a Warmachine collection, looking to get back into the game, I'm very excited that I don't have to try to track down models from 20 years ago that may not be in production anymore. That said, this style of bifurcated formatting for a miniatures game has never gone well. And that's partly because miniature games have such a small community that further breaking it down into sub-communities makes things even more difficult. And this is where I get a little bit antsy about this kind of mechanic. It has already been announced that Warfare Weekend, the most competitive event in Warmachine and Hordes, which holds what is essentially their world championship every year, is going to be using the unlimited method of play all the way through 2023, which means that I think most competitive events will follow suit. So if I'm a new player trying to get into competitive play, and the only models I can buy without trying to scroll eBay or, buy models that are previously in stock or maybe on clearance, which obviously is a crapshoot, especially within a game that has thousands of specific kits I might be trying to trawl through, are the new edition starter sets. It means that I essentially am not going to be able to interface with competitive play. And given that competitive play is kind of the draw of Warmachine, that's not a great start. That said, this is probably the lesser of two evils, because the other option would be for them to basically axe the unlimited mode entirely and alienate the entirety of their existing player base, which is equally bad. I think they've kind of just been dealt a bad hand here because of the evolution of the game, and there's not really a correct answer. I am just a little bit worried that outside of building small communities of people that are playing the Prime format, there's not really going to be a lot of interaction between the wider Warmachine community as a whole and the new players that are being brought in by this edition. This article goes a really long time talking about some of the reasons that they're making this decision and some of the alternatives that they discussed over the course. It's pretty long and kind of boring, so we're just going to go ahead and skip it. Now, I mentioned before that there was a real problem with theme forces in the 3rd edition of the game, and it really robbed a lot of the creativity from list construction. So one of the announcements here is that they are getting rid of theme forces, but basically just reorganizing list construction to operate similarly to a theme force. And this is through a system called cadres. So essentially, each faction, so in this case they're giving the example of the Signar faction, which is good for me because that's the faction that I used to play and make YouTube videos about, is going to be broken up into these 3 cadres. And some cadres may be compatible with one another, but not all of them. So in this case, if you elect to play a Storm Legion army, you can include units from the Storm Legion sub-faction, and you can also include units from the Stormsmith cadre. But on the flip side, Gravediggers, which is all of their regular army troops, their trenchers and stuff, cannot be included in a Storm Legion army and vice versa. I'm sure that these flowcharts will be expanded as more cadres and sub-factions get added to the armies in the game, but I have to imagine that most factions are going to have a little triumvirate like this, at least at the get-go of release. This is, I think, a pretty good compromise, because there's still going to be a lot of optionality in your armies, but they're still going to be able to restrict some units from playing with each other, which means that any particular combos that may be too strong, they can really head off at the pass by including them in separate sub-factions. Now, there's a lot of other information in this article that I'm mostly going to gloss over, because the next thing that we're going to talk about is their timeline of release, and we can glean some things from that, and then we can get kind of nitty-gritty and talk about some mechanics. So they did release their roadmap for their new releases in Mk4, and I think in addition to the announcement itself being kind of bereft of excitement, this is also a little bit concerning to me. The thing that you'll immediately notice is that there's a lot of identical icons here, which is basically meaning that they're releasing rules and units for the same factions. And then you'll notice as well the time frame along which this release cycle progresses. This is not going to be a fast transition between Mark II and Mark III. Instead, it's going to basically take a whole year, which is a super duper long time. Essentially, the real exciting stuff starts to happen in September, when new starter sets and rules for the updated game start to be released. From there, legacy rules for all of the old factions, the pre-Mk4 factions, so the existing models are going to be released. So this is essentially, I think, going to be kind of the start of the new edition. They're going to release entirely new rules for everything in the game, as well as starter sets for the new updated faction. Whether or not they'll be compatible with the already existing models from those factions from Mark III, I'm not sure, but I kind of hope they don't actually, so that there is a reason to buy into the Mark IV models rather than just play your old Mark III stuff. So the factions being released now are Orgoth, which is a brand new one and comes from the dark days of the background. It's like kind of a lore thing, and the updated Signar faction. Then afterwards you get an updated Cadre faction. Now the game already has a ton of factions, so this is a very small selection of them. From here in April we're going to get an updated Retribution of Syra faction, but this is only 4 factions, but this is about 10 months worth of progression, and only 4 factions for the new game will have been released, which is an absolute glacial pace of release, especially when we consider the new production engineering that Privateer Press is taking on. This line right here is pretty interesting because Privateer Press has announced that their new Mark IV models are going to all be 3D printed. Now, as far as I know, they're not selling STLs. They're literally just building a printer farm in their production facility, printing out a ton of models in resin. Now, I'm not sure exactly how I feel about this. It seems to make sense quite a bit, and especially for a game that is not, exactly in the best of shape and has a relatively small community, 3D printing does make sense because the overhead costs are extremely low. However, that also raises the question why they would have to wait so long to start releasing new factions for the game. I don't think that there's an enormous amount of resources to be able to push towards this new release if they can't release more than 4 starter sets within 10 months, since basically all they need to do, besides designing new mechanics for those factions, which I'm sure they already have drafted out, is just sculpt a couple of new models for them and then immediately begin 3D printing them for people. I'm also a little bit concerned about the quality of models. I love 3D printing as much as the next person, but I know that 3D prints can be relatively brittle sometimes, and especially if you compare them to the PVC style of plastics that Privateer Press was using previously, while those didn't look great and didn't model particularly well, you could basically hit them with your car and they would probably be okay. So moving from that to a very finicky resin like 3D printing, I mean, obviously it depends on the exact methods that they're using quite a bit. It's a little bit questionable to me. But that said, a lot of the tenor of this announcement is how much Privateer Press wants to entice new players into the game with this new edition update. But it doesn't seem to me like they're really going to be able to do that particularly well with this super duper slow schedule of releasing. But speaking of the games themselves, one cool thing that Privateer Press has done in this case is release previews of the updated rules set. We do have previews of cards available, which I'm not going to go through in great detail, but what I would like to talk about are some of the changes that they discuss in their article. I have read through, for the most part, the updated rules, and one thing that I do appreciate about Privateer Press games, and Warmachine in particular, is that the updated editions haven't been dramatic changes from previous ones. So unlike Warhammer, where they'll come back and, a ton of base mechanics have changed mostly for no reason, the changes in Warmachine editions tend to be relatively minor. And that's basically what we have here. A lot of it is in the service of streamlining the game. One thing that they've removed is model facing, which was a cool thing in Warmachine, where your model's line of sight could only be traced from the front of the model, and you got bonuses to be attacked if the attacker was behind you. That said, for some reason, the bases included in the models were just like sort of totally featureless circles, as most bases are, which meant that players had to independently go through and mark the facing of their models, which was annoying and stupid. Nobody liked doing it, and it created a lot of questions over the course of games. Sometimes you would just mark your bases incorrectly, and you could have gameplay consequences. Free strikes have also been removed. These are like attacks of opportunity that you gave up if you ever moved out of melee with somebody. Instead, moving out of melee is basically going to be like falling back in 40k. You can't attack in a turn that you move out of melee. Seems good. Basically, instead of dealing damage to people, which was an interesting consideration, it meant that you could move in and out of melee with people as long as they didn't have weapons that were powerful enough to do a ton of damage to you, which was okay. But now how it's actually just gonna, have a big impact. There's also been a simplification of unit rules. So these are multi-model units that, like squads effectively in Warhammer, that would all operate together. And these have been streamlined quite a bit. They previously had a very complex interaction of rules where you had an officer in the unit that would project orders out to the other models in the unit who had to stay within a certain radius of the officer. They were kind of fun to play around with. I think a lot of the things we're going to talk about, but kind of unnecessarily finicky. Now, I don't think I love the new mechanic. They're pulling a mechanic from basically Star Wars Legion and their other property, Warcaster Neo Mechanica, where instead of moving each model in the unit individually, you move a single model in the unit and the rest of the unit is placed in a formation around them, which certainly cleans up a ton of movement. It makes, the gameplay a little bit faster, but is kind of lame. So I don't know. I don't know if I care that much about it, but I think I like the previous version better. They also have a similar change that 40K made in 8th edition to AoEs and sprays, which used to use a special template that you had to buy separately. Those have been simplified for AoEs, or for spray attacks, just basically to hit everything in a straight line, and AoEs to just hit things within a particular distance of the target, rather than having a circle that you had to trace on the table and then would move if you missed the target. There was a lot of interesting play with AoEs and a lot of sort of mechanical design space that the game ended up moving into, where you could have AoEs with persistent effects or even with buffs associated with them that you could then try to miss your target with and get them into particular areas of the table. That was pretty cool, but again, kind of extremely complex and very difficult to explain to a new person, not to mention the fact that it was kind of difficult to just operate on the table. However, that said, there are a lot of really cool mechanics that they are introducing that are brand new to this edition of the game. The pre-game phase has always been really important to Warmachine. Previously, you would play with multiple lists when you went to a tournament, and then you would, after reviewing your opponent's lists, you would actually determine what army you were going to be playing, and you and your opponent would do that in secret, which means a lot of times you could get into interesting games of list chicken, they called it, where you would maybe have one good matchup that you were trying to get yourself into, but you had no control over what your opponent was going to pick, so they could have picked their list that was less good into you. Or you could bring a main army and then another army that would be able to counter particular meta contenders, and that made it a lot easier to, have a relatively balanced meta game when everyone, if they really needed to and they had a good flexible caster as their main army, could play a pretty reasonable game into the top faction of the game if they could bring a lot of specific technology for that. This kind of emphasis on pre-game flexibility is embodied in this new racked spell mechanic, where they're not called commanders. They used to be called warcasters and warlocks, which I think is still the terminology used, but the now overarching term is the commander. Your commanders have abilities that you can select pre-game, so you can have options to switch them out before the game begins after you know what your opponent is playing. So that's super cool. You also have now a hand of command cards you can use. This is very much a la like Marvel Crisis Protocol, which has its tactics cards. You get 5 of them, just like Marvel Crisis Protocol, and they're one use only, up to 2 per turn. And it sounds like, at least initially, they're going to do very kind of minor things, like allow you to move through terrain and attack incorporeal models, basically, are the 2 examples that are given. But I think these are mostly in there to try to resolve particularly bad matchups. So again, you're trying to enforce this kind of balance to the game where before the game begins, even if you're playing into an army that you're not necessarily good into, you can rearrange your spells and you can take command cards that can potentially help you in that matchup. And that's super duper cool. They do talk a lot about Warjack and Warbeast customization here. This is just basically giving Warjacks and Warbeast options for war gear that you include when you build your list. I thought when I originally read this that you could actually switch out their weapons before each game, which I thought was like maybe the coolest thing ever. But instead, it's when you build your list and you have to pay points for them and all that stuff. They talk about this like it's a really big deal, but it's kind of not, because previously the different war gear for a Warjack was just essentially each warjack with a different set of weapons would just be a separate stat card, a separate data sheet, effectively, and you would just pick which one of those you wanted. So there's maybe a little bit more optionality here, but each kit, when you bought them previously, would have all of the different weapons for each variant of that warjack, essentially, and this is just the same. So it's not going to be that big of a deal, I don't think. They also talk about these assassination and execution modes, which they kind of put a ton of emphasis on, which are kind of odd. One of the big criticisms of Warmachine is that one of the win conditions is killing your opponent's commander. And once you do that, they lose the game immediately. Now, obviously, that maybe sounds bad if you're coming at it from the standpoint of a game like Warhammer, where all of your models are kind of equally disposable. But Warhammer's already introducing those mechanics slowly but surely, where, if you lose warlords, you get enormous statistical penalties. If you are playing the correct mission in GT Nephilim, for example, and your warlord dies, you don't get any CP for the rest of the game. That's a pretty big deal. If you're playing Tyranids, like I do, and you lose your warlord. And on top of that, the game is designed almost entirely with this win condition in mind. So these commanders are not easy to kill, and you can play very conservatively with them in such a way that you never put them in danger of being killed. So while it is this huge piece of criticism that's leveled, and kind of one of these arguments that are brought up whenever people talk about why they don't play Warmachine, like, oh, I've never tried Warmachine because I heard if your commander dies, you lose. It's not like that big of a deal. You don't really think about it too much when you're playing the game. Now, it seems to me like they have tried to head off this criticism by including this new execution mode, where only an enemy warcaster can actually kill the enemy commander. So you don't have to worry so much about your commander being in the wrong position. And from a new player standpoint, I understand, why they would want to do this. There are penalties that you still get assigned if your commander is killed by a non-commander enemy unit, but you don't immediately lose the game, and you can kind of learn from your mistakes there, which is good, I guess. But I think that it's going to be kind of touted as the answer to this argument that people are like, oh, I don't like Warmachine because the commander could die. And they'll be like, well, if you don't like that, you can just play execution mode. And that feels kind of disingenuous to me, because I think outside of new player experiences, the execution mode is probably never going to get used. So, take that with a grain of salt, I guess. It does feel like a lot of these articles are just heading off potential criticism and FAQs from existing players. And I don't know. It doesn't feel like that's where your energy should be pointing if you're trying to promote the release of this, what is basically a new game. There's also some other small changes. We already talked about the removal of theme forces, and they're getting replaced by those cadre mechanics, which is good, I guess. But again, the cadres are mostly theme forces, like in all but name only. Although they're more flexible than that, so I appreciate that. Previously, attacking your own friendly models is a really big deal in Warmachine, and they have slowly been phasing out mechanics that allow you to do that. It looks like in the new edition, you can just only attack enemy models full stop, which, it's a lot of nuance that you lose, but I totally understand it, I think. As well as some other kind of minute changes that, have, I guess, varying degrees of gameplay impact, but aren't like super pertinent to this discussion. The other thing that I want to talk about here is this discussion about more critical effects. In Warmachine, a critical effect takes place anytime you roll. Most of the time you roll 2 or 3 d6 on an attack roll, and a critical hit occurs when you roll any double on that. So it's not like a 1 in 36, like if you were rolling double ones or double sixes or something like that. It's a little bit more impactful. But given how impactful occasionally these critical effects are, they talk about them adding spontaneity and excitement to the game, which isn't, for a game that prides itself on being the most competitive tabletop miniatures game, I don't know if that's what you want, to have the game be more random. Anytime we get the verbiage like it contributing a rousing play experience, I'm a little bit wary, because it sounds very sort of Blood Bowl-esque to me, where random stuff can happen and maybe you win or lose the game based on a couple dice rolls, and that I don't like. So that one worries me a little bit. But again, I think that the proof is in the pudding of actual gameplay there, because it does depend on what those critical effects are, what units they're on, and the volume of them throughout the entirety of the game. But overall, mostly simplification of the rules, which I think is good. So that's, I mean, it's not brief at all summary of the changes that are being made to Warmachine and Hordes, but I guess I wanted to close the video out just with some personal thoughts. I will probably buy into it when the new edition comes around, and it, at least I'll get a starter set and I'll play some games. I'm sure there will be some, new player friendly leagues and stuff that we'll do in a local capacity, and I still have an existing group of friends from the area who still play. I still have a very close-knit group of people who, I will be able to experience the game with. Whether or not that means I'm, gonna get it super hard into it, I don't know, because again, there are kind of a lot of red flags here, and the biggest one being that I don't feel like this announcement was what was needed to regenerate and reignite excitement in the game. And I'm not saying that what was posted didn't take a lot of effort. I think the problem was that it was clearly a lot of effort from what is an incredibly small and probably kind of underfunded team. I already said it before in the video, but when you're trying to instill confidence in a new game system and bring new players into the community, and the entirety of your announcement to do that is a 2-minute video that's inside a different video and about what is probably 10 pages of a Word document on a white background with black text and no pictures, man, you're really struggling here. And it's not like they haven't done these big blowout announcements in the past. It just feels to me like they're not in a position to be able to do that, which again is not confidence generating for how the game is going to be going in the future. I think I'm very pessimistic about this new announcement. I am excited that a lot of the mechanics that I didn't like in the past are changing, and I am excited that there is sort of now an avenue where new players can get into this system from the ground up with these new starter sets and with the new Prime format events. The community has to obviously be able to embrace those new players and not just create insular communities that only play their legacy format. Whether that happens or not, we'll see. But I don't know. I think it's going to be kind of a long road to travel for Privateer Press. Anyway, I wish them the best of luck. I hope the gameplay is good. I'm pretty excited to actually maybe give it another go, get some locals together, and maybe at least in here play some games and just chill out. Hopefully it'll be good for that. We'll roll all those crits and have a rousing time. But anyway, that's it for today. Super long video that I have to edit down. Oh my god. But I had a lot to say, I guess. Thanks everyone for supporting the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise, YouTube channel members, Twitch subscribers. All you people are great. Remember to keep it classy, folks. Have happy wargaming.